Good morning and welcome to Sunday at First Presbyterian Church. I'm Pastor Danny Deeth, and we have just celebrated the coming of the Christ child into the world. Now, what do? It's the right time to ask ourselves, what is the importance of that event? What does it mean for me? And how do I live my life in response to what has just happened? Well, I want to invite you to join this amazing church family and this safe place to explore your faith as we are asking the same questions. So come on in.
From Matthew 25, 31 through 36. When the Son of Man comes in his glory, and the angels with him, then he will sit on the throne of his glory. All the nations will be gathered before him, and he will separate people one from another as a shepherd separates the sheep from the goats. And he will put the sheep at his right hand and the goats at the left. Then the king will say to those at his right, "Come, you that are blessed by my Father, inherit the kingdom prepared for you from the foundation of the world. For I was hungry, and you gave me food. I was thirsty, and you gave me something to drink. I was a stranger, and you welcomed me. I was naked, and you gave me clothing. I was sick, and you took care of me. I was in prison, and you visited me." This is the word of the Lord. Thanks be to God.
Friends, you ought to be pretty familiar with this next bit of Scripture. Our second reading comes from the first of Paul's series of letters to the church in Corinth. We're going to be reading from chapter 13 today. Let me know if it rings any bells. "If I speak in the tongues of mortals and of angels, but do not have love, I am a noisy gong or a clanging cymbal. And if I have prophetic powers and understand all mysteries and all knowledge, and if I have all faith so as to remove mountains, but do not have love, I am nothing. If I give away all my possessions, and if I hand over my body so that I may boast, but do not have love, I gain nothing. Love is patient, love is kind. Love is not envious or boastful or arrogant or rude. It does not insist on its own way. It is not irritable or resentful. It does not rejoice in wrongdoing, but rejoices in the truth. It bears all things, believes all things, hopes all things, and endures all things. Love never ends. But as for prophecies, they will come to an end. As for tongues, they will cease. As for knowledge, it will come to an end. For we know only in part, and we prophesy only in part. But when the complete comes, the partial will come to an end. When I was a child, I spoke like a child, thought like a child, and I reasoned like a child. But when I became an adult, I put an end to childish ways. For now we see in a mirror dimly, but then we will see face to face. Now I know only in part, then I will know fully, even as I have been fully known. And now faith, hope, and love abide, these three, and the greatest of these is love." This is the word of the Lord. Thanks be to God. Well, friends, it happened again. I don't know how or why it continues to be this way, but I have the opportunity to share a few words with you this morning on the heels of a holiday. And I don't know if you missed it. If you went to Publix like I did this week, it would have been impossible for you to miss it. But it was Valentine's Day just a couple of days ago. I hope that you all either celebrated on the day or you have plans to make up for the fact later today, possibly. But regardless, I hope that you've celebrated your loved ones and that you have all been celebrated as well. And last but not least, I hope that you had the opportunity to sneak away with some of those heart-shaped Reese's peanut butter cups, because we all know that the holiday Reese's are better than the regular peanut butter cups. Friends, I don't know if you noticed or not, and it's okay if you didn't, but we're going to be diving back into the letter to the church in Corinth, and specifically the chapter that's been deemed the love chapter. If you were here for worship with us 2 weeks ago, you would have heard Reverend Danny Deeth preach a message on this text. I had the opportunity to share a word with Edgewood at their service. And in my mind, we just celebrated the day of love. What better thing to do than to return to this letter that addresses love? And uniquely today, we're going to be pairing that, as you heard, with the Matthew 25 text. And I think it's got some interesting things to share with us today. But a reminder, I want us to spend some time talking about love today. And not just emotional love, but the Christ-like kind. The kind that's not just a feeling, but it's more so an action or a commitment, a way of life, and what I believe to be the heart of the gospel. And to do so, I've had the opportunity to preach here a couple of times, and in that time I've had the opportunity to share with you a variety of different illustrations and teaching instruments and methods. We've had conversations about the Lord of the Rings, Star Wars. We've also talked about what noodle shape is the ideal to retain pasta sauce and to stay on the fork. And today wouldn't be a sermon from me if we didn't have another unique illustration to draw from. And so what better thing to use today than a comic book when we're talking about love? So today, I'd like to share another aspect of myself with you. I'm a really big fan of the X-Men in particular. And so if you ever find your way upstairs to the second floor of our office building on this side of the church, you'll see a variety of these comics, print copies up in my shelves. I've got X-Men copies like this one. I've got Alpha Flight. That's the Canadian branch of the X-Men. I've also got some of the New Mutants, which are the teenagers that come along later on down the line. But we're not going to be talking about the X-Men just because they're my favorite and you're a captive audience for the next 10 to 15 minutes. I think that there's actually merit to these stories, to these characters, beyond being superheroes, right? There are all kinds of fantastic stories that we are familiar with from the works of comic books. And shameless plug for Marvel at this point, they're going to be rolling them out in the upcoming series of movies, so we're very excited about that. But the X-Men stories are something different. They're not your Spider-Man, they're not your Superman, and we're going to unpack some of that today. A little bit of history for you. The X-Men stories are about being different at their core. These people are dealing with issues of fear, hatred, and being pushed to the margins just for existing, for being different. They're stories about people who are rejected by the world but still choose to fight for justice, hope, and for community. And when I think about those words, that collection of concepts, it reminds me a lot of what Jesus' ministry looked like while he was on the earth. And it also sounds a lot like what I believe that the church is supposed to be known for as well. But too often, I think that the church has fallen short. You see, the love that we're called to by Paul as he dresses down the church in Corinth in his letter in chapter 13, Paul is talking about love. He's also talking about how we ought to practice love. Love is patient, love is kind, and it never fails. I don't think that that's the love that we always end up practicing and showing to the world. In verse 1, Paul says, "If I speak in the tongues of mortals and of angels, but do not have love, I am a noisy gong or a clanging cymbal." How often has the church's voice been a clanging cymbal instead of a voice of grace? In Matthew 25, we hear Jesus talk about care for the least of these, and I wonder about how often we're prioritizing that. Today, I'm hoping that together we can begin to reflect honestly on how we can do better. And I don't want this to be motivated by guilt or shame. That's the old way. That's the old way of doing business, and I have no interest in that. Instead, if there's going to be any kind of change that takes place or any kind of inspiration, my hope is that that stems from a deep desire to become more like Christ. You all, if you were here 2 weeks ago, heard Pastor Danny talk about the beautiful poetic description that Paul uses to talk about love. A love that is not envious or boastful or arrogant or rude, and it does not insist on its own way. It is not irritable or resentful. Love that protects, trusts, hopes, and perseveres. It's a high standard, but it's the one that we've all been called to as followers of Christ. I, in the spirit of transparency and honesty, am going to use a turn of phrase that I use with the youth and some of the young adults from time to time. I'm going to invite you several times throughout the course of this message to join me in the trust tree, okay? This is a space where we encounter one another in a spirit of vulnerability, transparency, and honesty. Along the way in this sermon, I'm going to provide space for us to reflect and evaluate honestly, because I think that that's really important for us to figure out where it is that we're headed. And so, my first question, my first invitation to you. If we're being honest, do we believe that the church has always lived up to the words of Paul that we find in chapter 13? Have we been patient and kind to those who are different from us? Or have we sometimes responded with judgment and exclusion? Have we honored the dignity of all people, or have we let our own fears and biases shape how we treat others? Have we really protected and persevered with the marginalized, or have we turned away when things get uncomfortable? Tough. I'd say, historically, little column A, little column B. One of the reasons that I have deep love for the X-Men is because of what they represent. You see, the X-Men were first created in 1963 in the month of September. And they served as an incredible metaphor for what was happening in the civil rights movement in the United States at the time. That metaphor extended to the characters themselves within these books, with Professor Xavier and his vision of harmonious human-mutant coexistence standing in for Dr. Martin Luther King Jr., while Magneto's rigid attitude toward the defense of mutant kind ended up reflecting a philosophy more akin to that of Malcolm X. The church even gets lifted up during a run of these comics, interestingly enough, by Christopher Claremont, and that series is called God Loves, Man Kills. The antagonist of this storyline, William Stryker, is a fanatical televangelist and leader of a group called the Purifiers, which is an anti-mutant extremist group. His ultimate goal is to eradicate mutants whom he views as an abomination against God. He believes that mutants are not part of God's plan and that their existence threatens humanity. Stryker rallies his followers to pursue systematic oppression of the mutant population and justifies doing so using religious rhetoric. It's terribly interesting when works of fiction are eerily similar to real life. I'm aware that we do not have superheroes flying around us and lifting cars up over their heads like in comics, but I am able to see that there have been moments in time where similar actions have been taken in the real world, whether that be using the Bible to argue for the continuation of slavery or for weaponizing Scripture against our fellow human beings because who they love makes us uncomfortable. When I see my faith represented in creative works like books, movies, or in these comics, and that it's rooted in fear and hatred, it forces me to reevaluate my own faith and my responsibility as a Christ follower. Some hard concepts. So let's find some common ground. Love doesn't celebrate harm. Yes? Can we agree on this? Something I think we should all be able to agree on. We find it in Paul's letter in verse 6 of chapter 13. Love does not rejoice in wrongdoing, but rejoices in the truth. That means that love isn't found in taking joy when people disagree with struggle. It isn't found in celebrating policies that leave children without food or families without a home. And to keep it fair and balanced, it's also not love when we take joy in humiliating people who think differently from us. Love does not seek to win arguments. That's a message I need to hear. It instead seeks to build relationships. It doesn't take pleasure in someone else's suffering, no matter who they are or what they believe. I believe that the X-Men in these stories remind us of this too. They're constantly faced with fear, prejudice, and injustice, and while some mutants, like Magneto, who I mentioned earlier, choose to respond with anger and retaliation, others, like the headmaster of the X-Men's headquarters in school, Professor Xavier, choose a different path, the path of love, of justice, and peace. I believe that that's the path that Christ has called us all to walk. The X-Men are a symbol, as we've talked about before. They represent a troubled time during the history of our great nation, but they also represent individual stories as well. Stories of open acceptance, love, and community. They stand as protectors of the marginalized, always fighting for a world that often rejects them. Their very identity is built on standing with those who are cast aside, offering not just refuge, but also belonging. Some of their most well-known members reflect this even more deeply on a personal level. Iceman, one of the original founding members of the team, came out as gay later in his story, reflecting the journey of so many people who have struggled to be accepted as they are, the story of many folks that occupy the four walls of church buildings. His story resonates with those who have felt they needed to hide parts of themselves, even from those closest to them. Then, one of my personal favorites, Nightcrawler, a character whose deep faith and struggle with his own identity as a mutant mirrors the challenges many people of faith experience when they feel caught between their religious upbringing and the reality of the real world around them. In spite of rejection, persecution, all of the above, Nightcrawler holds fast to his belief in grace and in love. His faith is not in the institution that has sometimes failed him, but instead in the God who sees and loves him fully. Through these characters, the X-Men show us the power of love, of acceptance, and wrestling with faith in an imperfect world. I'm going to invite you to climb back into the trust tree with me, friends. We now know or have some idea of what the X-Men are known for. What do we believe that the church is known for today? Are we seen as a place of love and of welcome, a community that practices or protects the vulnerable and embraces the outcast? Or are we known for something else? Something maybe a little bit less Christ-like. The world is watching, just as it watched Jesus when he walked among the oppressed and the sick and the sinners. What do you think that they see in us? The words that Jesus has for us in Matthew 25 make it abundantly clear that what really matters is how we treat the most vulnerable amongst us. For I was hungry and you gave me food. I was thirsty and you gave me something to drink. I was a stranger and you welcomed me. I was naked and you gave me clothing. I was sick and you took care of me. I was in prison and you visited me. And again, hearing these words, I'm forced to ask myself whether or not I'm actually participating in this call. Have I cared for the unhoused? Have I spoken up against systems that disproportionately harm folks in minority groups? Or to get more specific and to name and claim truths, as we are in that business here in the church, have I done a good job of standing up for those who look different than me based on the color of their skin or their sexual orientation? Or have we as a people stayed silent because it's easier? Have we made churches places of radical welcome, or have we built up barriers, both spoken and unspoken, that keep people out? You might have heard a little bit of self-reflection in that moment just now. And I need to confess something to you, church. I have done a poor job. I have struggled for some time with fear and anxiety over preaching a message like this. I have shied away from hard conversations because I was worried about how people would react, about whether I would be misunderstood or rejected, about whether or not I ought to be talking about things that are not my own lived experience. But I know that that's not love either. Love does not let fear dictate its actions. Love steps forward. Love stands in the gap, even when it's uncomfortable. And if I'm asking you all to reflect on these things, I have to do the same. I pulled this story, this example of the X-Men, not just because it's an opportunity for us to go back to a place of childhood wonder and excitement, but because I think that it's a great primary resource. These people know what it's like to be outsiders, to be judged before anyone even knows them, and I think that that's something that we can all relate to as individuals. In doing so, they remind us of an important message, that being different is not a threat, it's part of God's diverse, beautiful creation. When we reject the least of these, as Jesus said himself, we reject Christ. But when we embrace them, we embrace Jesus' own heart. This message is not one that's just about the church as an institution. I believe that it's one for us as individuals to take to heart as well. Because in practice, what does it look like for us to live out this kind of love? What does it look like when we become aware of the barriers that we've built up in our own hearts? What does it look like when we become more conscious of the people that we have struggled to show kindness to? Christ's call is a personal one. For love is not an abstract idea for the church to work at. It is an everyday choice that we as the people of God must make in our own lives. How can we be more patient? How can we be more kind? Where can we extend the love of Christ more? I had a phone call with my dad a couple weeks ago where I was talking to him about working on first the sermon that I delivered at Edgewood that was a little bit different than the sermon that they ended up getting on that Sunday. And it included a lot of the message that I'm talking about today. And he was very upset. He was very bothered by it. He said, "Aaron, politics doesn't belong in the pulpit." And I agree. It's not my job to tell anybody how to vote, who to back, or do any of those things. But I do believe that it's my responsibility to lift up the words of our Redeemer. And I think that they speak for themselves. It's not something that I feel like I have to advocate for any more than the words that are printed on the page. And so, friends, my message to you today is that this is not a sermon that I want you to feel condemned for hearing. Instead, I want this to be an invitation for us to reflect and an opportunity for us to engage with Jesus in a renewed way. I'm hoping that this message provides an opportunity for an honest look at where we as the people of God have fallen short, where we're called to stand in the gap, to show love, and to choose to be better. Love is not just about words written on Valentines and candy hearts, it's about action. It's about standing with those who have been pushed aside, speaking up for justice, and creating a community that truly reflects the heart of Jesus. Paul closes his letter to the church in Corinth, specifically in chapter 13, with these words, "And now faith, hope, and love abide, these three, and the greatest of these is love." Love is the defining trait of who we are supposed to be as followers of Christ. Without it, all of our knowledge, all of our doctrine, and boy, do we love our doctrine and our traditions here in the PCUSA, all of those things are hollow and empty. Like the X-Men, we are called to be a people of hope, people of justice, people of radical love. We have the power to be a force for good in the world, so let's use it. Let's be the church that Christ calls us to be, not one that seeks power or comfort, not one that seeks to create homogeneous echo chambers of people that all think, feel, and look the same. Instead, let's become one that embodies love in every word and deed. Because at the end of the day, when Christ looks at us, I don't believe that he wants to see a people who are focused on following the rules. I believe that he wants to see a people who are determined to love all of God's creation dearly. Hallelujah. Amen.